Okay, so we're experimenting a little bit with how we tie up our tomatoes this year because we've planted mostly all indeterminate tomatoes, and those are the ones that will grow to an indeterminate height. There's no maximum on the height they can get. It just depends on the water they get, the fertilizer, the amount of sunshine, and all of that. So they can get incredibly tall and gangly. So I want to compare and contrast a couple things that we've done here. This is the newest patch of tomatoes that I planted right here. And these are, I believe, all heirlooms. And then on the end there's a row of tomatillas there, which I'll probably use in some salsas or something like that. I've never grown tomatillas before, but I know they're great for making salsas or that sort of thing. So anyways, I have several varieties of heirloom tomatoes in here, and I've started tying them up on this end, as you can tell. And this is called the basket weaving method of tying tomatoes. And what you do is you put just these construction stakes or whatever you can find that's a reasonable cost. And the suggestion that I read was on a university website, and they suggested putting double ones on the ends, on both ends, and then putting a single stake every 2 tomato plants throughout your row of tomatoes. And so that's what I did. And then you go in with some kind of a twine, and you essentially wrap it around your stake 2 times, go on one side of the tomatoes, wrap around the next stake, go on the other side of the tomatoes. So you're just weaving back and forth on one side of each 2 tomatoes, and then you go around the end stake, you come back, and you go on the other side. I'm not sure if that's making sense, but what you end up with then is you have twine on both sides, and it's one length of twine that goes all the way up and all the way back, and then you tie it off at the end. So on these 2 rows right here, I've got two heights of the twine. One's about, 6 inches, somewhere in there. The next one is probably about 10 to 12 inches, just depending. And then, like, you can see that with these, some of these in this row, they're ready to be tied up again. So I could go ahead and start doing the next one pretty soon. You just kind of look down the row and see if they're all just about ready to be tied up the 3rd time, and you just keep doing that. Of course, with these stakes, I'm only going to be able to go this high. The tomatoes will probably go taller than that, although it's kind of late season. It's already the middle of August, so we'll see what happens. I planted these very late. If you don't tie up indeterminate tomatoes, you have this. They just will fall down on the ground and spread out on the ground and get very just crazy all over the ground, and they'll set the tomatoes down there. But then you have a lot of opportunity for blight and end blossom rot and issues with the fruit themselves because they're setting directly on the ground, and you don't have as good of ventilation down there to keep the bugs and the mildew and whatever else you may have in your region going on with your tomatoes. And so that's just an example of, I've tied up 2 rows, and then I have, I suppose another 7 rows to do here over the next day or so to get them tied up also. And then the tomatillas. Like I said, I'm new to tomatillas. If you think indeterminate tomatoes take off like crazy, just grow tomatillas. They're also an indeterminate, and they branch out, and they are absolutely crazy. But they have these really cool little fruit on them that first it sets on a real nice little husk. These pretty little husks that kind of look like lamp shades, or like those little Japanese lanterns or something. And then the fruit forms inside of that. And so when they're ready to be picked, you just peel that little husk off, or it kind of peels itself off, and you just have this beautiful little green fruit that you can chop up, dice up, and use in making your sauces or whatever you want to use it for. So that's kind of cool. Okay, so this is actually part 2 of the tying up tomatoes video, but this is actually my first tomato patch that I planted this year, and this was what I thought was going to be my tomato patch. I thought I was only going to have these this year, and so this was basically the size that I had anticipated. And then I had the opportunity to get all these other plants for free, and gardeners can never turn anything down for free, so I had to do that too. But these tomatoes are pretty much all ones that I raised from seed. I started them in the house under a grow light from seed, and they are heirlooms. There are a handful in here that are not heirlooms, and again, part of the when somebody gives you something as a gardener, you have to take it. So I have some cherry tomatoes in here that I don't remember now where I got, but I love cherry tomatoes, so I have those. They're just a hybrid, and like a sweet 100, something like that. And then I have a couple tomatoes, maybe Better Boys or something like that, that I got from a local like farm store that I think gave tomatoes away on Mother's Day. So, you know, you can't turn that sort of thing down. And I'm all about comparison and contrasting with how things grow. So I put them in there and I know where they're at. And it's pretty obvious when you start watching. But these are also, like I said, heirlooms, indeterminates. Indeterminate means they'll grow very high. Most hybrid tomatoes and a lot of the ones that you see in greenhouses or the ones that produce early are usually determinate tomatoes, and they'll grow to a certain size, then they kind of stop and they just put on their tomatoes. They don't keep growing and growing and growing. So that's the difference. Determinate tomatoes, you don't have to tie up. They'll usually stay nice, or you can just put a little tomato cage on them to help support them, and they're good. You try to put these babies in a regular tomato cage and the whole thing will topple over because they get too big and too strong for it. Okay, so of these indeterminates that I have, this was just something that Rick and I decided to try. We took what we had available around the place, and we always have metal fence T-posts, and then we always have some miscellaneous 2x4s or some kind of boards that we bought too many for a project, or we just didn't do the project, or maybe it's something that we tore apart and we just kept the boards. And so we decided to use that, and then just some wire, and we put the T-posts in, and then we put boards about at this height, so about 24 inches off the ground probably, and then again up about, I'm guessing about 4 feet, and to see how this would work. And then once again, because I'm kind of cheap, I just took a bunch of old t-shirts of Rick's, which he had approved that I could use, and I stripped them, you know, just tore up or cut them into strips. And then that's how I tied up the tomatoes, because I figured that would be something that probably wouldn't hurt the tomato itself too much with the wind, because we get a lot of wind out here, and you know, it would do a fairly good job. The only issue, I guess, with using something like this with a cotton t-shirt material is that when it rains and such, it does stretch. But when you tie up tomatoes in this manner, you kind of have to keep coming back and readjusting your ties anyway, because the tomato keeps growing, so the tie on the tomato is going to keep moving up. And I guess that would be the downside to doing it this way, is that you have to keep coming in and tightening up how you tied. And I just tightened them up a few days ago, so they're pretty good. If you look closely in here, you can see, you know, there's some tomatoes coming on. It's kind of a late season this year, so most of the tomatoes are still green. I've gotten some red cherry tomatoes, and I think here and there I have some that are starting to turn. They're kind of at that milky green color right now, which means they're just starting to turn. They're not deep green, and pretty soon they'll start turning red. And then what I believe will happen is probably all of them are going to be ripe at the same time, and I'm going to be furiously trying to sell them, give them away, can them, something. That's just the way tomatoes work. But I do have several different kinds, so there should be a bit of a space between when they all ripen up. I did do some Brandywine tomatoes, and if you can kind of zoom in close here. These, I'm trying to remember what my different kinds of tomatoes are. You know, this is just a typical tomato leaf. Anybody that grows tomatoes, that's a very typical tomato leaf. But sometimes you'll hear people talk about a potato leaf tomato, and that's going to be a Brandywine. And that is, this one right here is a Brandywine, and it's got a smoother edge on it. And you know, it may have the lobed leaf like so, but they're just a bigger, smoother edged leaf, and you can just pick them out pretty easily compared to your normal potato leaf. And Brandywines are just an old heirloom that are really well liked. They've been around forever, and so I have some Brandywines kind of interspersed in here, and I have a bunch of others. I have like a a pineapple heirloom that stays kind of a yellowish color, and gosh, I can't remember now all the different kinds of tomatoes that I did, but I have them marked down at the base so when they start coming on ripe I can check them. Here's a cherry tomato. Cherry tomatoes are like tomatillas. They grow like crazy and it's hard to keep it all together so that you can pick them. They're kind of cool, so you can usually pick off, well, we got some weed seed going on here. You can usually pick off, you know, like a whole branch, little cluster of cherry tomatoes, and if they're not all ripe, just set them on your kitchen counter and they will ripen up. The cool thing that I think heirlooms are noted for is their shapes. They're not the traditional perfectly shaped, perfect looking tomato that you see in the grocery store, because those were actually bred to look like that, and I have issues with that whole thing anyway, but that's probably a different story. But if you get in, I don't know if you can get in here, Rick, and look at this really gorgeous heirloom tomato. Some people would say it's ugly. It's all in your point of view. It's got all these wrinkles on it, and it's just, you know, it's not a nice, smooth, little, perfectly round tomato. There's some cherry tomatoes in there too, it looks like. But that's what heirlooms look like. I think this guy here is actually like a Better Boy or something that I got free from the store because it's a nice, smooth looking one. But we'll see if there's any others over here. Heirlooms are just very unpredictable what they're gonna look like. Here's a couple down here that are all knobby. It's like a, you know, tomato under a tomato on that one. And that's what I love about them, because generally the knobbier your tomatoes look and the weirder they look, the better they taste. I know that's kind of lumping things together, but heirloom tomatoes have the best taste of all tomatoes. They have very distinct flavors, you know, generally very juicy, just wonderful tomatoes. So if you have the space for it and you want to mess around with tying them and doing all this, and you have to do some pruning on tomatoes too when they get to be this size, then mess around with heirloom tomatoes, because I just think it's so worthwhile in general. Even though hybrids are bred to be more disease resistant and pest resistant and all that, heirlooms in the long run have actually proven to be the better ones for that, because they are just a stronger tomato. And when people start messing around with hybridizing plants and making them really strong in specific areas, there's always another area that they're really weak in. And so I like heirlooms. I'm not a big hybrid fan, but you know, there are some benefits. Like I said, a lot of the early tomatoes are hybrids. They're all bred for a purpose, and usually it's the looks or the number that you can fit into a box so that they can be shipped across the country, or the fact that they come ripe at a certain time. That's why hybrid tomatoes have become popular, because they're very very predictable in what they'll do. You don't get odd shapes to them, and then they don't grow out of control like these do. But I think they're beautiful. I love everything about tomato plants anymore. I used to not be that wild about growing them, but the more I do it, the more intrigued I am with them. And if you can hear, I don't know if you can hear it, but my guineas like to go in under the tomatoes on warm sunny days like this because they have shade down there. And I'm all good with that, because guineas like to get grasshoppers and that sort of thing. And so every now and again I'll see a few of them come racing out of under there, and I know that a grasshopper got loose and they're going after it. So they're down there resting right now in the shade and kicking their heels up for a little siesta this afternoon.